Hi, this is Elisabeth Hancock, host of the Great Awakening podcast. And this week, I thought that we would take a look at the Nummo, who are the stories of the Dogon tribe. And I found some interesting research. And this is because I've been updating my second book. And I actually have found a couple of mistakes. And one of the mistakes I discovered was that I thought that the Nummo of the Dogon tribe, I thought that they came from Sirius, because they have a lot of information about the binary trinary star system of Sirius. And they also have other information as well. They knew about Jupiter's 4 moons and things like this. But they essentially, their homeworld was actually the Pleiades. And when I read this, I felt like so much slotted into place because, as we know from many of my other presentations, the indigenous people, they say that we have come from the stars, that we come from the Pleiades. And I couldn't understand what they meant by this. How could we come from the Pleiades? And then I began to understand what they meant, because the Nummo were actually a spiritual being. And we're going to look at all of this as we go through the presentation today. But let's just start by looking at how many things slotted into place once I understood that the Nummo came from the Pleiades, not Sirius. And we can see that the Dogon tribe stories are also the same stories as the Mesopotamian Anunnaki stories. So this explains so much. It explains why we come from the Pleiades, or why our ancestors do. It explains the myths about mermaids. There are just hundreds of stories about mermaids. These stories go back sort of 1700s, 1600s. Really incredible stories. There are also stories in every single culture about reptilian humanoids. And there are still so many cultures that say that there are reptilians living in the mountains under the earth. They honor these people. And I think that we can't really just discount things and say that none of it's true. I think we have to follow the evidence of where we're being led and just keep a really open mind. It also explains human sacrifice and cannibalism, where these came from. And it starts to show the difference, the split between the physical and the spiritual body. So we can also see where we get our spiritual roots from. And we can also see how our physical body is so sophisticated and intelligently designed. It really is intelligently designed. We can also see where we get our subconscious mind from. And also taking a closer look at the subconscious mind, which in my opinion is the universe. So they linked us, they hooked us up to the universe, if you like, and to the memories, the Pleiadian memories, to all these sorts of memories of different star systems, other parts of the universe. But first of all, who are the Nummo? Where did they come from and what did they look like? Because we have physical accounts of what they look like. And that is why we know that they look like mermaids and they look like reptilians. And this is why I feel that we have both of these physical forms in our world, and many other physical forms as well, because they didn't just make one species, they made many species, because they were trying to create a biological form to house their consciousness. So this information here, and much of the information about the Nummo, the Dogon people, is taken from Shannon Dory's book, The Masters or Mistress of Speech. And it's a fascinating book, because what the book has done is it's essentially looked at the anthropologists, Marcel Griel and Germaine Dieterfen. And they were the ones who discovered the Dogon tribe in the 1930s. And the Dogon tribe essentially had not had any dealings with people from modern society. Marcel and Germaine, they lived with this tribe for 15 years until eventually they were able to be given the Dogon tribe stories about the creation of humans, who the Nummo were. And as Shannon Dory talks about in her book, Marcel Grau actually just wrote down these stories, and he didn't try and interpret it, which has actually been really helpful, because it means that we can see exactly what these Dogon tribal stories are. And they describe being visited for hundreds of years by a group of spiritual beings called the Nummo, who arrived here in a metal craft, and they called this metal craft the smithy. And they've been honoring these Nummo since the 13th century. And this is because they, every 60 years, they do a Sigwe ritual, which is the ritual that honors Sirius B, because Sirius B for them is the Jackal. And again, we'll come back to him in a minute. But it shows us that they've been honoring these Nummo since the 13th century. But the Dogon tribe stories go back much further. They go back to Atlantis. And we can see this Atlantis. It was the primordial island of creation. It's talked about in the Egyptian texts as well. And all of the indigenous tribes, they all track their ancestors back to Atlantis or Lemuria, which seemed to be the original continents until we had catalytic events. We've had many catalytic events in this world, and this is one of the ones that happened, and eventually Atlantis was said to have sunk. All the information from Atlantis was taken to Egypt, and Egypt was then a follow-on from Atlantis. And these Dogon tribe also moved to Egypt. And then when a war broke out in Egypt around 3000 BC, they then moved to Mali in Africa, and they took all of their Dogon tribe stories with them. So the chief of the Dogon tribe described the Nummo as a fish, snake, or serpent-like humanoid with a forked tongue, green skin that can occasionally change color like a chameleon, pointed teeth, and apparently some of the Dogon women actually filed their teeth to sharp points to emulate them. They had no ears, red eyes, horns, and an elongated skull, and they were hairless. And according to Dogon myth, some of the Nummo came here because their planet was dying. But they were also shapeshifters, and they could change their physical form. They could walk using their fishtail or slide, but also appeared to use a device to move around on. And this vehicle they called the iron sandal, which seems to sort of suggest that they only had one foot, which you could see with a fishtail would only have one end to it. But interestingly, this iron sandal also comes up in Greek myth as well. And we'll carry on coming back to these because, as Shannon Dory points out in her book, the pagan symbols link to the Egyptian hieroglyphs, which also link to the Dogon. This iron sandal was described as being able to scorch the ground and affect the crops of the Dogon tribe. So we can see that it was an actual physical thing. And the Nummo people, they preferred to live in cool caves or in tunnels inside the earth, and they moved around at night. So the sun was too hot for them, and they were obviously not used to it, and it possibly would burn their skin. They didn't have fur or hair. And you can see here, these statues here that you can see in the image, these are actually some of the Ubaid statues. And Dory believes that these Ubaid statues are actually the Nummo. So these are the same people. And you can see when you look at them, that looking at the description of the Nummo, you can see that they possibly would be the same. And the reason that Dory feels that they are the same is because the tattoos that you see on the figurines, the women or the people of the village, they used to put the same tattoos on their body as well. And if we think about it, they used to file their teeth as well. And we can see that they possibly were the same people. So they were honoring these Nummo people. Now, if we look at these statues, they are obviously very serpent-like statues, lizard serpent-like statues. And these little bubbles that they have over their skin, these same bubbles are also imitated by the Dogon people as well. So there seems to be too many coincidences to say that they are not the same being. So it's quite interesting and helpful for us to have a physical representation of what these spiritual beings look like and to see that they are physical beings. The Dogon tribe said that their homeworld was in the Pleiades and was where they created the 8 ancestors and Leb. So Leb was the final creation who went on to become the mother of all humanity today, and who they call the master or mistress of speech. They created their first creations on Earth by adding Nummo DNA, or spiritual DNA, we could call it, to Earth DNA. But it went wrong, as they didn't understand Earth DNA and assumed it was the same as their Nummo spiritual DNA. Now, as I said before, the Pleiades is said to be the ancestral home for so many cultures and indigenous people, but it's too hot to sustain life in our physical world. And you can see the Pleiades there in the image. So what does it mean? Well, for me, I think the only thing it can mean is that the Pleiades is a spiritual place. And when I think of spiritual, the word spiritual, I think of other dimensions that exist all around us, and we could call spiritual energies, and which the ancient Egyptians were working with spiritual energies, as we'll come back to in a bit. These are all the different cultures that honor the Pleiades and talk of the Pleiades being their spiritual home or the home of their ancestors. Although the Nummo were self-fertilizing, they still needed to occasionally procreate in the normal way. Otherwise, their genes would degrade. So their plan was to add their spiritual DNA to the Earth DNA and create a physical form that could house their Nummo soul. They were an immortal species because they could remember their past lives when they reincarnated into another self-fertilized life. So birth and death were like a snake shedding their skin for them. Apparently, they began to add their DNA to the Earth DNA, and the genetic experiment started off well, and they created an androgynous and self-fertilizing Nummo, which was the female of their species. And according to Shannon Dory, this is how the goddess culture developed, and where the wisdom from the earliest mystery schools come from, which eventually led to the development of paganism and Christianity. And the reason that she believes this is because she can see that the symbols are the same. So it's showing a link between these different civilizations, these different cultures. But when they went on to create the male, they realized that they had actually failed in their experiment. The male was not a success, and he came out as a single-sexed male that was born with more Earth DNA than Nummo DNA. And thus, he could not remember that he was a Nummo. He could not remember that he was a spirit. He was born without the capacity for conscious genetic memory, which meant he was mortal, and he was not immortal like the Nummo was. In his book, Growl refers to this as the Jackal, and he was referred to as being alone from birth and was unable to connect to the Nummo spirit or the animals and plants in the way that the Nummo could, which seems to tell us that they were telepathic and used ESP or sonar in the same way that dolphins can. Dory goes on to suggest that the Nummo had not fully understood that the soul or spirit was intricately connected to the biological DNA of the earth. Now, if we think about Pythagoras, who used to say that everything on earth shared the frequency of earth, and other planets held their own frequency, but everything on those planets shared the same frequency. And we could think about the universe being made up of infinite frequencies, and at different frequencies, different levels, we have different worlds. And we could see that Earth had its own frequency, which did not mix with the world that they came from, which was in the Pleiades. They tried to replace the soul of the earth animal with the Nummo soul, but it created irreparable damage that they could not undo. They seemed to feel very bad about this and talked about how they had raped the earth. But in trying to make the Jackal, they also lost their original Nummo souls to earth as well. So down the bottom left-hand side, we can see the Nummo figure with male genitals. So this is showing the male of the species. This is the male Nummo of the species. Here we have the one on the right, the bottom, which is the female of the species. And she seems to be breastfeeding a baby with an elongated sort of coffee bean shaped head. And she herself has a serpent face, again, the same tattoos on her body, the same little sort of nodules on her shoulders that they all seem to have, that the Dogon tribe people were copying as well. And here we have up here, so this is possibly what the first human form looked like. And we'll come back to that one in a second. And this one here, she is said to be Namu from the Mesopotamian stories. The Nummu say that the birth of this single-sexed being, the Jackal, was devoid of soul or spirit, created many problems for them, and they spent considerable time trying to undo the genetic changes. They couldn't delete or eliminate what they had done, which I imagine as a multidimensional reality or a multidimensional world, which I expect that we are, I imagine it probably is quite hard trying to undo a multidimensional being. So they were not able to eliminate or undo what they had done. All they could carry on doing was diluting the DNA, which they did by creating more ancestors, which they called them, in order to try and dilute and change the combination of Nummo and Earth DNA. So they describe these different genetic experiments, which they call weaving, as word. The Jackal caused many problems for the Nummo, and one of these problems was that they crashed the Nummo's flying craft, which they called the Smithy, into Earth and caused a catalytic event. Dory believes that this is what the Greek myth of Phaethon, son of Helios, is describing. And we can see here, we've got the top image is the Greek myth, which is Phaethon, son of Helios. And then we've also down here, we've got one of Bridget Knapp's images from the film set from Egypt. And she was talking about in the last presentation that these are not film sets, they're actual Egyptian statues. And we can see here that this chariot with the horse and the man standing in the chariot, it's so similar to the Greek myth because they couldn't delete the first two ancestors, so the jackal and the jackal's sibling, the female. What they did was they used the DNA from the first female and the male to create 8 ancestors, and they were all different dilutions of DNA. So ancestors 1 to 4 were androgynous male, and ancestors 5 to 8 were androgynous female. In order to dilute the corrupted DNA from the original word, ancestor 1 was supposed to mate with ancestor 8, who was the female of the species, but she was also the most diluted. Unfortunately, what happened was a forbidden sexual relationship between ancestor 1 and ancestor 2 created a huge problem for their experiment because it brought the corrupted DNA of ancestor 2 back into the human DNA. The Nummo were not happy with this, and they are said to have thrown all 8 ancestors out of the homeworld, the Pleiades, and back to Earth. And, we could think of this maybe as the fallen angels. And then they began a new word based on their DNA. The chief of the Dogon tribe was called Ogotomali, and he relays that Lib was the final word and a regeneration of ancestor 8 using ancestor 7's DNA, because she was considered the perfect blend of Nummo DNA and Earth DNA. They called her the master or mistress of speech because, of course, all of these different beings were androgynous anyway, and they symbolized her with the lion and the Pleiades. And she was self-fertilizing and immortal, as in she could remember her past lives, and her descendants went on to become the ancestors of humanity. Now, down here, we can see this is the Great Mother. And, I'm going to be doing another podcast around this, the Great Mother, but we can see here, this is a Roman statue, but this Great Mother comes up in so many different cultures, and this lion also seems to come up connected to this Great Mother. And we think about the Nummo being essentially a predominantly androgynous female species, then we can see how the Great Mother could fit into that. And the fact that Lib is symbolized by the lion, again, we can see here the Great Mother with the lion. Now, apparently, the Nummo spent many, many years genetically tweaking human DNA to try and repair the damage they had done. And as I said before, they felt very bad for raping the earth and seemed to view her as a living being. And certainly, when you look at reality on a spiritual level, as opposed to a physical level, you do get the sense that on a spiritual level, everything seems to have a soul. Now, we know from the animists, and many indigenous tribes are animists, the Celts were animists, that they believe that everything is a living being. The Cree people believe that we manifested our soul into being, so we created our physical body. And when we think about the Nummo creating the physical body for the soul to be housed, then maybe this can give us some sort of physical definition of how they did this. In Grohl's notes, the first woman and man are described as having red eyes wide open. They were described as having big eyes. They also had forked tongues. So we can see that they were made in a similar form to the Nummo, and they were human from the head to the loins, and then serpent below this. They had green skin, but were also covered in green hair, which seems to be sort of the earth DNA, because the Nummo did not have hair. Their arms were flexible, but without joints, so you can imagine sort of waving around like an octopus tentacle. And both the Nummo and their offspring were amphibians who spent their time in water. If we think about that and we look at here the different images, we can see here this is possibly what the first human looked like. So it makes me wonder if maybe it was the Nummo who brought the humanoid DNA or human DNA to this planet. So we know from my second book that Dr. Gary Nolan, who's from Stanford University, he created some sort of a tracking method to be able to trace human DNA, and he traces it back 9 billion years. Of course, this doesn't necessarily have to be correct, but it is interesting, and it shows us that human DNA does not come from this planet or world, because our world is supposed to be only 4.5 billion years old. Now, again, I don't know if all these dates and numbers and things are real, but this is what we have to go on at the moment. So as a researcher, I have to use something to research. And so there are some pieces of research which I still use until I'm proven otherwise. And we don't know where the human DNA comes from. So if it was the Nummo who brought the humanoid DNA to Earth, then possibly they also brought the hairless body to Earth. The first humans are said to have had green skin, but also with fur. But you can also see in these pictures here that they're quite without fur, these particular pictures. So at some point, the genetic alterations possibly would have meant that fur or hair was no longer on the body. And there is evidence to show that we are more hairy now than our ancestors were. Again, showing this addition of genetics, this constant tweaking of genetics, which we can see in our genes. So the Nummo kept tweaking the DNA of this newly created human by adding more earth or mammal DNA to their amphibian or reptilian DNA, as well as creating many different types of mermaids or amphibian beings. They most likely created many different reptilian humanoid forms on Earth as well. And this is because they would have taken their actual reptilian amphibian form, but created legs, because our planet has probably got a lot less water than their planet has. And therefore, in order to create a physical body, it would make sense that they would make a physical body that could walk, as well as physical bodies that could swim in the sea. Now, as you may remember from my second book, there's an astounding amount of evidence to show that we are more akin to marine animals than we are to land animals. So much similarity between us and marine animals that science developed a theory that they call the aquatic ape theory. But what I'm seeing here, and we can see some of these sort of reptilian serpent beings, and the one from Sierra Leone is the most interesting, because if you look at the pointed teeth, I would imagine that this possibly is what one of their original 8 ancestors looked like. We have obviously the Mesopotamian ones, and we've talked about the little nodules and the tattoos. We have here another one from Indonesia. And this again seems to be sort of like a bit more like a sort of frogman. And then we have this one from Japan, which again is more like a serpent being. And it just all seems to be just little tweaks, variations on the original amphibian reptilian form that was us. In the ancient Tibetan book of Dryan, it talks of a serpent race who descended from the sky after a great flood and taught mankind civilization. It described them as having human faces and long tails, and the Dravidian people and the Nagas were said to be the result of inbreeding, or genetic tweaking maybe, between humans and these serpent people. The Nagas were described as dark-skinned, flat-nosed, They lived in caves and they were cannibals, but they were also described as riding around in sky chariots and seemed to be very advanced or had access to very advanced technologies. As we know, the Nummo were supposed to have arrived here in a metal craft. We also know that the Nummo had more spiritual DNA than the human beings that they designed, they created. So having more spiritual DNA means that they are more connected to spirituality, but spiritual in this case, I would say, is probably another word for the universe or multidimensionality. So this access to more spiritual DNA seems to give them access to more advanced technologies, advanced abilities. We also know that around 10,000 years ago, after a great flood, many new varieties of plants, trees, and fruits were introduced to our world. The Nummo's smithy, or metal craft, was said to be filled with DNA. But we also know this story as the Anunnaki from Mesopotamia. So are the Anunnaki and the Nummo the same people? If you've read my second book, Human Origins, the Multiverse and Our Star Ancestry, you'll know that I talk about the Mesopotamian tablets and the Anunnaki quite a lot in there. But what we're seeing here is that the Dogon stories predate the Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets or the Sumerian stories of the Anunnaki, and that possibly the Nummo are the same people as the Anunnaki. As I said before, Shannon Dory, she has tracked the symbols between the pagan symbols, the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the Dogon stories, and she has discovered that there's similarities between them, which is why she feels that they are connected cultures. Now, we know that Egyptian hieroglyphs come up all over the world, and we can see from Bridget's presentation in the last video that the Egyptian culture seemed to spread much further than just Egypt. And she shows us that there are many different Egyptian structures found in America as well. In the Mesopotamian tablets, we have the Anunnaki gods, Enki, Enlil, or starting with Anu, and then Enki, Enlil, and Nihilsag. They created the humans from clay. So we could see clay as earth DNA, and the blood of a god we could see as a soul. In the Mesopotamian literature, Nummo is the primordial goddess and creator god associated with the primeval waters. And we know that the Nummo are an amphibian being who came from a water planet. She is said to be the mother of Enki and responsible for creating humanity and the earth. So again, Nummo and the Nummo, just way too similar to be unconnected. We have the Anunnaki gods who came from the sky to earth, just like we have the Nummo came from the sky to earth. And the Dogon texts say that the creator god or their creator god was Amma. And in Mesopotamian texts, we've got Anu as being the first god. You'll know from my books where I talk about Anton Park's book, where he compares Genesis to the Mesopotamian text. And he really shows that they are the same stories. But the biblical translations that we have today are very misleading. They've been completely mistranslated. And again, all of this manipulation seems to track back to the church and the Abrahamic religions. Now, I'm not saying that all the Abrahamic religions are bad, and I'm not saying that all the stories are bad, but some sort of inversion or manipulation seems to have begun with the church. But it again shows us that the Mesopotamian texts came first. They came before the biblical texts, but the Dogon stories preceded the Mesopotamian texts. So it's seeming to show that the Dogon, the Nummo, were the first ones. We can also see that the Mesopotamian tablets, they have changed the original mother goddess stories, just like the Bible has also changed the cuneiform stories. And why would they need to do that? Well, I think they would need to do that because they're trying to hide the spiritual nature of human beings. And when I say spiritual nature, I mean multidimensional nature. And again, we'll come back to looking at spiritual, multidimensional, all these sorts of things in a bit. But essentially, Anu, he was the original god. And then we have Enki and Enlil and Ninhursag, who are supposed to be his children. And they are supposed to be the ones who created the human form. But we also know that the Nummo were shapeshifters. And shapeshifters, this essentially means that they were alchemists. They used magic symbols and words to do extraordinary things, which we can see in our myth stories. And if we think about the Dogon stories being the same as the Greek stories, and then being the same as the Mesopotamian stories, it seems to show that these are all the same people. And they just have these incredible abilities that we or current modern day humans don't seem to have. Although the old world architecture seems to insinuate that we did have those abilities, but for some reason now we don't. So we can see up at the top here, we've got Dagon, and that is so similar to Dogon. We've got the half man, half fish. They always show them as having the beards, which I find very bizarre. You know, an amphibian being, why would they need a beard? Here we have Enki down the bottom with the pointed hat, with the little things coming off, seeming to look like some sort of advanced technology there. But he's always associated with water. These are the Sumerians. And again, you can see that same beard. And the image that we have up here, so this is Nummo and Anu. These are the creator gods. Again, the serpent beings with faces. Now, of course, they don't actually have to be really what they look like. This could just be indicating or showing that they have magical abilities, magical properties of some sort, because the serpent beings, the serpent gods, were always described as possessing magical abilities or skills. And the serpent beings or serpent gods really are in every single culture around the world. The amount of serpent beings, snake beings, lizard beings, they just really come up in every single culture. So here we're going to take a look at Lebe. Lebe, according to the translated stories from the chief of the Dogon tribe, Lebe was the first successful self-fertilizing androgynous female. She is said to have become the ancestor of all of humanity today. But the Nummo considered themselves an androgynous female species, hence they honored the female. But they still needed to procreate occasionally to preserve their DNA, which seems to be why they had the male of the species. In the Gnostic texts, which stems from paganism, they also say that the female was created first. And this is Lilith, who comes up in so many of our religious stories, and she's always referred to in very derogatory terms. She's called a baby killer or demon, but then a mate was created for her. But in the current religious texts, aka the Abrahamic religions, or at least the Church of Rome, we know that they say that the man was created first, Adam. So if the Dogon stories are the first, and the Gnostic stories confirm that the female was created first, then we know that the church lied. And what they did, they tried to bring in patriarchy, a patriarchal society, into what I suspect was once a matriarchal society. Paganism was the original religion, or at least it came after the Dogon stories, but it spanned across many cultures. And we know that before the Church of Rome, they changed the Gnostics texts. These were used and then altered and edited to create what we have today as the Bible. Paganism honored the female and ran for thousands of years, because we can trace back at least 20,000 years ago this mother goddess religion, which shows statues running from France all the way to Siberia. And again, you know, we see these fertility goddess statues, but they go back thousands of years. And they seem to show that the female form was being honored. Now, that in itself could simply be women trying to get pregnant in possibly difficult time periods. However, our myths are full of entire islands and communities of women. Greek myths, Celtic myths, and we can see that all these different cultures are connected. I think they're all connected, and they all track back to the Dogon stories, and they all track back to Atlantis. And then in the Greek myths, we have islands that are women only. And we have the nymphs, the sirens, the witch. These are all connected to different strains of mermaid, reptilian, connected to the sea in some way. And Lebe was a self-fertilizing androgynous female. Therefore, these islands of women could have been self-fertilizing females just as much as she was a self-fertilizing female, because they had no men. One of my Chinese friends told me that in China, it still exists today, there's an ancient tribe of women in China who essentially, they don't have men in their village, but when they want to get pregnant, they allow men into the village, procreate with them, but then they bring the children up themselves in their village. So again, it's a female-only culture, and it goes back a very long way, seeming again to show that there were entire villages, cultures of women only. And interestingly, in my research of secret societies as well with satanic cults, the satanic cults are also said to be ruled by women. So they have these sort of high priestess, these black witches. But this is kept very secret because they're trying to create this illusion of a patriarchal society, but actually they still have a matriarchal leader. As you can imagine, they keep this matriarchal leader very, very quiet because transgender is one of their biggest inversions or agendas today. This cross between genders, that manipulation of the masculine and feminine, is something which they've been manipulating and playing around with for decades now. It also got me wondering if the female orgasm is a relic of this self-fertilizing process, because it's essentially got very little to do with the actual physical procreation of making a baby. And if you think about it, the female orgasm brings a huge amount of energy into the sacral chakra, which is the uterus, which is the place of creation. And as such, it's where babies are made. The chakra system may pull the soul in through the crown chakra down into the sacral. And the Egyptians believed that the soul returned to the stars on death, whilst the indigenous people say that we come from the stars. And some say that we return there when we die. If we think about it, we don't really know what stars are, although they're said to be suns and there are planets revolving around them. When we actually look at stars and try and get a close up, and we look into stars, all we see is just light, just fuzzing light. We don't see physical form at all. We also know about the virgin births, of which there have been many talked about in history, not just Mary and Jesus. And they seem to show that this ability still exists. The entire Mary Magdalene line was said to be able to do this. They were self-fertilizing females, essentially. And according to Margarita Riglioso, who I interviewed on my podcast a few years ago, there are apparently still women that can do this today. It's a skill that you can learn or relearn, and she has written an entire thesis on this. So she's done an awful lot of research into it, but it is something that apparently women can still do. There may be some bloodlines who are still more able to do this because they never lost the ability, but apparently all women can do this. So again, showing that we are linking to this self-fertilizing Lee bloodline. She's said to be the ancestral of all humanity. So if we think about the mermaid myths, and if you've read my second book, you'll also have read in there that there are some modern day stories about mermaids as well. Possibly the most interesting part of these mermaids for me is the Dracs. And they are apparently around France, and they are said to be half mermaid, half dragon. Now that looks exactly like the Nummo were described as being serpent face, fork-tongued, spikes, but they also had the tail as well. These Dracs are also connected to the Melusine sea monster, and we see that's the Starbucks logo, which we can see down below, but we can also see an image there of a Melusine. And interestingly, she looks as if she's wearing a medieval costume, and she has that sort of queen's crown on her head. Now, Richard the Lionheart's family were also just said to be descended from a Melusine. And we know that the European royalty, one of the things that they have is red hair. Queen Elizabeth I was also related to Richard the Lionheart. And we can see Elizabeth I had a very strange physique and face. And really, it's very hard to tell if she was a man or if she was maybe an androgynous shapeshifter. So an androgynous self-fertilizing shapeshifter. So another interesting point about this family, the royal red-headed family, is the red hair, which I also talk about in my second book, because I really feel tracking the red hair leads you to the truth of our human origins. And there are many stories about mermaids with green hair. As we know, the Nummo, the first humans that they were created with green skin and green hair. Now, that would be hair on their body, but it could also possibly at some point be hair on their head. However, what if green hair became red hair? And the reason that I thought of this, because it just popped into my head about color blindness. And you can see that there have been so many genetic alterations done to the human genome, which have possibly created many distortions. And if we consider that the Nummo were creating our DNA energetically, it was all being done energetically or spiritually, because we now know that DNA is energetic. And they were using a process called weaving, and they used to call their weaving words. So it's all sound and weaving, and it sort of feels like energy work today. But color blindness is said to affect 4.5% of the population who see red as green and green as red. So what if they are seeing the truth and we are seeing a mind manipulation? So we are not seeing the colors as they really are. Anyway, possibly that's a long shot or way of looking at it, but I've been tracking the red hair for a long time, and it really is a very interesting trait, and one that we really do not know where it comes from. But we can also see this very white skin with Queen Elizabeth I as well, very white skin. And again, if we look at the Ubaid statues, the statues that supposedly are the Nummo, again, we can see this pale skin, this sort of white, pale, clammy skin, no hair. And we think about that as being the human DNA, the humanoid DNA that they brought to this earth plane. And now we have this humanoid DNA all around the earth plane. Now, thinking about the virgin births, the self-fertilizing female of Mary and Jesus, we also note that Mary Magdalene is called a prostitute in the Bible, but prostitute was another name for mermaid. And as we can see, the red hair European royalty, they link back to mermaids, Melusines. Possibly, if she was a self-fertilizing female, she would also be linked back to this first creation, Lebe. And therefore, possibly, what we're hearing here is Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute, but she was a mermaid. So she was part of this original Lebe self-fertilizing female species that we then all became her ancestors today. But another interesting piece of information is the fact that there are so many myths and stories of people coming from the sea, coming to help after catalytic events, that the gods still live in the sea. Enki, we know, is supposed to live at the bottom of the ocean. And there are said to be entire cities under the ocean. And we already know that more metal craft come out of the sea than actually come from the sky. We've also got the Merrows of Scotland. And the interesting thing about the Merrows is that they wear red caps for breathing. So this shows that they can't necessarily breathe under the water themselves. They use advanced technology to be able to help them breathe under the water. And we know from the video I did about mermaids that there are also the amphibian beings that were discovered in Lake Baikal in Siberia. The stories came out during the Cold War. One of the stories here is that they discovered these foot-tall amphibian beings that were in the lake, and unfortunately their soldiers were killed by accident when these amphibian beings pushed out this sonar energy, which meant that the soldiers were pushed up to the surface of the lake too fast, and they suffered from the bends, and some of them actually died. Lake Baikal is said to be the oldest and deepest lake in the world. So we don't know what's in there. And it looks very much like there are still amphibian beings living there. So we talked a lot about the jackal. And Shannon Dory believes that Yahweh was the jackal because there are some amulets that show a link between Yahweh and the Dogon tribal stories of the Nummo. The jackal, as we know, or the bloodline of the jackal, is the second creation, ancestor 2, but they created him wrong. And he was devoid of spirit or soul. He was unable to connect to nature, to animals, and unable to connect to spirituality. The Nummo were a spiritual species, so their homeworld of the Pleiades was a spiritual place. Now, spiritual doesn't necessarily not mean physical. It means it's a different frequency, a different vibration, which in my understanding is a different dimension. This jackal caused a lot of problems for the Nummo. They couldn't just eliminate him. They essentially had to keep refining the combinations of the Nummo DNA and the Earth DNA in order to finally get to their Lebe, self-fertilizing female. But the jackal was still around, and he was just unable to have spiritual thoughts. And this reminds me very much of the Church of Rome, the Spanish Inquisition, and how these people, they just had a complete inability to see beyond the materialistic worldview. And because they lacked empathy and compassion, they were also able to kill anybody that could. They felt incredibly threatened by people who have connection to spirituality. People have connection to other realms, to other energies, other frequencies, and essentially people who do not fear death. Because the more spiritual you come in your thinking, the more you understand and know that death is not the end. But these people, the jackal bloodline, are unable to understand this. They're unable to grasp the concept. And so for them, death is the end. They are scared to die because they believe that this is the end of their existence, because they do not have that spiritual connection. And that spiritual connection will always tell you that this is not the end of your life. In the work of Mauro Biglini, he has done decades of research of the biblical texts, and he believes that Enlil is the same person as Yahweh. We know that Yahweh in the Bible exhibits psychopathic traits, but he also seems to be able to be pacified by Abraham. There are certain people that seem to know how to manage him, again, showing that there's a real level of insecurity within his psyche. Now, we know with these Mesopotamian tablets that they are talking about what we call cloning. However, possibly what they are talking about is self-fertilizing. So in the Mesopotamian text where it says one god should be slaughtered, then a god and a man will be mixed together in clay, let a ghost come into existence from the god's flesh, and let the ghost exist so as not to forget the slain god. So the cuneiform tablets may not be describing the moment when the Anunnaki gods created mankind by killing a god, but actually describing the self-fertilization process of a god, which we could see as a soul. The Nummu's soul is the god entering into a physical body at the point of death. So if the Nummu were able to do this, then are other people able to do it? We know that there are many different bloodlines on this planet, and there are bloodlines who will only procreate with their own bloodline, and there has to be a reason for that. They are preserving something, preserving some sort of DNA. But we know that these Enki Enlil, these can be traced back to the Nummu. And it seems to me that when the spiritual Nummu DNA interacted with the physical Earth DNA, that something corrupted at that point. And it seemed to create some sort of human being that was devoid of morals, ethics. And we can see in the bloodline of the jackal that this is very much the case, that he has these psychopathic traits. He does not have connection to spirit or nature. And therefore, he not only walks alone, as the Dogon tribes say, but he also cannot feel empathy or compassion. Now, the company 2045.com are aiming to be able to transfer consciousness into a human by 2045. Where would they get these ideas from? I think it's because there are bloodlines on this earth who still know about these things. They know our true human origins, our true human form, and they want to be able to make this happen. So if you imagine the jackal wants to be immortal, like all the spiritual beings in this world who already know that they are immortal. The jackal wants to be physically immortal. Therefore, the jackal would put funding and budgets into being able to create an avatar and being able to download their consciousness into a physical being to make them immortal. And we could say that this has perhaps already been done, but the jackal bloodline are trying to make themselves immortal because they are devoid of soul or spirit. So as we know, the jackal is described by the Dogon chief as having no spiritual connection at all, and thus he is alone from birth. The Nummo are very connected to the plants and animals through ESP in the same way that dolphins are. And dolphins are a very unique animal because they are highly spiritual, and I suspect already move through different dimensions, just as whales possibly do as well. They are higher frequency beings, and they bring sound into this realm through their song, through their vibration. So this world is filled with different vibrations, frequencies, which is other dimensions. If we consider that Enlil is the same as Yahweh, is the same as the jackal, then possibly it's that psychopathic gene that is the bloodline that has lost connection to empathy and compassion. Now, even more interesting, the jackal was also called the smith. We know that the metal craft was called the smithy, but the jackal was also called the smith. And Smith is the most common surname in the Anglosphere countries. So United States, UK, New Zealand, Australia, it's the most common surname. Could this be the bloodline of the jackal? Could this be the bloodline of people who are possibly not able to connect to soul or spirit? However, that would be the pure bloodline of the jackal, which we could see as the oldest bloodline, the Lurie bloodline, the Rockefellers, Rothschild. If this is the pure bloodline of the jackal, who did not want to dilute their blood because they wanted to be without empathy, without compassion, then possibly this is that original bloodline. And we know that this bloodline, that they do procreate within their own bloodline, which means that they are still a pure blood jackal. Now, we also have the Smithsonian Institute, and we know that this is a very draconian institute, very conservative, which is a polite way of saying that they are censoring and suppressing truth. If we think about the Lord of the Rings and the latest version, the Ring of Power, Sauron in that is a smithy. So, the Nummu's metal craft is called a smithy. And how many medieval dramas, period dramas, do we see that they show a shot of a metalsmith? I mean, it is incredible how many times they do this sort of programming that's continually happening, programming to believe that smith, that this is because metalsmiths. Now, I'm not saying that it isn't because of metalsmith. I am saying, is it really necessary for the script of the film to show the shot of a metalsmith banging an iron bar so many times? We also have the Lord of the Rings with the Eye of Sauron, and we have in the Bible the Eye of Yahweh, the Eye of Yahweh. And see here we have on the dollar bill the Eye of Yahweh. And we also know that digital ID is the Eye of Yahweh. It is the increased control, the increase you are being watched. Everything is watching you, which of course digital ID, it's all watching us. The bloodline of the jackal that is devoid of soul and spiritual connection to take control of this world. Because then this will be a very one-dimensional, controlled, materialistic world. And we will have lost the essence, the multidimensional world that we can all feel in our heart is what this world is. So we can trace so much of the corruption and inversion to this jackal figure and the church, who are one and the same. They manipulated concepts of spiritual or religion and women and men. We know that the Greek Herodotus said that the Egyptians were highly religious, spiritual, and this civilization worked with the spiritual energies of the sky and the earth to create their world. And I think that that is because they had a stronger connection to spiritual realms, other dimensions. They worked with other dimensions. So the patriarch has taken out the matriarch of our world, and we can see that everywhere. If we think about the jackal, the single-sexed male, alone from birth, devoid of soul, devoid of spirit, that the jackal bloodline is unable to understand that the universe is inside us. He only has access to logic, rationale, and physical proof, a physical world devoid of soul. So although the Nummo added their souls to the Earth DNA, they then took their souls out again because it caused too many problems. But they couldn't completely undo it. It essentially created the subconscious mind. And we also know that Lieb, the final successful creation, she was the perfect blend of Nummo DNA and Earth DNA, which again shows she had the connection to the spiritual aspects of the Nummo. The Nummo came from the Pleiades. The Pleiades is a spiritual place. Doesn't mean to say it's not physical, but it's a spiritual place in that it's a different dimension to the Earth frequency. So the subconscious mind is the universe. By adding the Nummo DNA to Earth DNA, it gave us access to the same spiritual realms that the Nummo came from, and this inherent feeling that we come from the Pleiades, which is something that the indigenous tribes say, that our ancestors came from the Pleiades. Our soul or consciousness can remember so many past lives that span across the entire universe, because we hold spiritual DNA. The universe is not a physical place. It is a place for consciousness, of consciousness. We have the genetics in there of the Nummo spiritual DNA. We are connected to the spiritual realms. And I suspect that there are some other species that have discovered how to travel across the universe using consciousness. We could call it plasma consciousness, plasma ships. The Nummo were spiritual shapeshifters, which means that they were alchemists. And I'm beginning to wonder if this is where humanity is now. We're about to move into the universe with our consciousness, and the jackal is trying to stop this because they will lose control. They run a tight material world, but the world is not material. If we think about the secret space programs, where they essentially take children who have more access to their full consciousness or genetic memory and can therefore access more psychic abilities, memories of how the body and the mind actually works, of other worlds, we can see that we were able to do incredible things in Atlantis. And it seems that we were also able to do the same things in the old world. And it also seems that the old world is not that old, which means that we still have these abilities. We are the gods, but with switched off DNA. But what's happening now, and the geneticists can see this, we can actually physically track this. Our junk DNA is switching back on. And as this happens, we're starting to remember. We're starting to wake up. And what is it that we are remembering? We're remembering our past lives. We're becoming immortal. The Nummo were immortal because they remembered their past lives. We cannot move into the universe without spiritual connection, because the universe is a spiritual place. It's a place of multiple dimensions. If you've read my book, you'll know from chapter 4, The Human Origins, which looks at the Homo sapien, Neanderthal, all the different previous ancestors of Homo sapien sapien, then we can see from here that chromosome 2 is the one that shows signs of it being fused together. And also the tens of thousands of genetic alterations which were used to stabilize that genetic alteration. So it relates to the growth of the brain and connection to the neocortex. And this growth in the neocortex, essentially, it connected us to the higher realms, if you like, spiritual realms, because it connected us to emotions like compassion, sympathy, empathy. And the neocortex also connects us to the spiritual planes or higher dimensions, and it switches on higher functioning aspects. So it's what we call psychic abilities, ESP, which we've seen that the Nummo, they already had ESP. They were connected to the plants and to the animals. They were connected to everything on a multidimensional or spiritual level. If we consider the spiritual Pleiades and the hundreds of tales of shape-shifting reptilians, mermaids, and other humanoid forms, then we could see these as more spiritual DNA and less earth DNA, which essentially means that they are more energy and less density. And there are beings here who exist in other densities to us. There are beings on Earth that exist in other dimensions to us. Humans were possibly also made in different levels of densities as well. So we could see Pleiadian as spiritual, Earth as more dense, but there are probably different forms of densities at different levels. And there's life at every level, as we can see in the universe. But it's possibly, as David Bohm says, it's deeper levels of our existence. It's not somewhere to go outside of ourselves. It's somewhere to go inside of ourselves, deeper levels of our existence. So as we talked about before, the Dogon tribe, they practiced human sacrifice and cannibalism, which we've seen many different tribes also did the same. But this apparently began with Lib. Lib was sacrificed back to the earth and her body eaten to atone for raping the earth and to mingle her DNA back to the earth. So Shannon Dory believes that the Egyptian mummification process was a mimic of the Dogon beliefs, but maybe lost in translation because the mummification process turned up in our world and nobody knows quite where it came from. She goes on to say that the pharaohs would sacrifice themselves because they were the original bloodline, the royal bloodline. Certainly, if we were a self-fertilizing species and their physical body was simply to house and hold their soul, we can certainly understand how the physical body would not be seen as important at all. So maybe human sacrifice would look very different to the Dogon tribe than perhaps the Aztecs. In the height of the Aztec culture, up to 250,000 people a year were being sacrificed to placate the gods. In the Bible, Yahweh demands child sacrifice, which Abraham was ready to do, indicating that this was probably already part of their culture. So if we are realigning with our true human origins, and if we were the Nummo, if we were an amphibian-reptilian humanoid species, where does that take us now? Well, the transgender agenda is one of the key agendas of the parasitic elites. And I'm wondering, if we were an androgynous human species, if this is something which we are moving back into now, and transgender agenda is being used to invert that. We know that they use black magic to invert the truth, to alter the truth. Gene modification drug could be to stop our genetics changing because we can see that our genetics are changing. If we think about the spiritual switching on of our DNA that is moving us into a higher consciousness person, that higher consciousness person is able to connect back with the universe. The Nummo always said that we will become immortal again in the pursuit of wisdom and truth. So we become a higher consciousness people through the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge. And that's what we have now. The Great Awakening, as we discover the truth within ourselves, as more of our DNA is switching on, we're remembering more of our past lives, remembering more of where we've been before, where our soul has been before. And we are also getting disclosure. Disclosure is from within. Okay, so that is all for today. And I'm going to be coming back to this, but doing different aspects of it. All right, take care for now, and I'll catch up with you soon. Okay, bye.